Okay, hi. Wow, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to the Great Hall at Dartington tonight to be scared out of your mind, I think, basically. I just wanted to say hi as well to loads and loads and loads, hundreds and hundreds of people who've signed on Zoom. So I'm going to wave to the camera. How delightful. It's been more than a pleasure to have Mark Gatiss here this week. We've all been a bit giddy having him here. We've got on the front row some very budding writers who've had the most incredible writing experience this week. I saw one student lying on one of the tombstones in the graveyard writing, and I thought, yes, our work here is done.
Dead.
It's dead. And it has been awesome. We're starting a new writing program this year, and Mark has kicked it off beautifully. And I just wanted to thank Mark, who is a very dear and lovely friend of mine, for coming here this week and for also being here this evening. We're going to kick off with a reading with some I'm not sure
words.
Some words. And we're also going to have some questions from the writers. I would also like to say we have a new little shop. It's called The Little Shop, just near the Welcome Centre through the Arch. It's going to be open tonight till about 10. And some of Mark's books are in there and they're signed, so that's rather lovely if you want to pick up a book. So yes, we're going to kick off with something terribly spooky. Ooh. So welcome, please give me a huge round of applause for Mark Gatiss. Woo!
The night he passed is not one on which he looks back with any satisfaction. He was in bed and the light was out. He was wondering if the charwoman would come early enough to get him hot water next morning when he heard the unmistakable sound of his study door opening. No step followed it on the passage floor, but the sound must mean mischief, for he knew that he had shut the door that evening after putting his papers away in his desk. It was rather shame than courage that induced him to slip out into the passage and lean over the banister in his nightgown, listening. No light was visible. No further sound came. Only a gust of warm or even hot air played for an instant round his shins. He went back and decided to lock himself into his room. There was more unpleasantness, however. Either an economical suburban company had decided that their light would not be required in the small hours and had stopped working, or else something was wrong with the meter. The effect was, in any case, that the electric light was off. The obvious course was to find a match and also to consult his watch. He might as well know how many hours of discomfort awaited him. So he put his hand into the well-known nook under the pillow, only it did not get so far. What he touched was, according to his own account, a mouth with teeth and with hair about it, and, he declares, not the mouth of a human being. Good evening. Just going to take this opportunity to warm myself up. Welcome to this lovely but freezing hall. I've not prepared a TED talk or anything like that. I'm just going to say whatever comes into my head, but prompted by my friends here on the front row, who I've had the great pleasure of talking to and tutoring. This is the first time I've ever tutored anything, and I've had a wonderful time, I must say. It's been very rewarding, mutually, I hope, but certainly for me, it's been brilliant to hear all these wonderful new ideas and these wonderful talents and enjoy this remarkable place. I mean, so atmospheric. And actually, weirdly, just to have the sort of time allocated to just sort of slope off and sit in a churchyard with a pad and a piece of paper and scribble things down. It's been so much fun. So thank you for coming. I'm going to talk about ghosts tonight, in case you haven't noticed. What's the first question, please? Yes, lady in the red top.
How did you get into horror and ghost stories?
Well, I think I said earlier this week actually to everyone, it's, I often meet people who have had a very similar sort of life experience to me in the sense of they weren't very good at PE, they were quite bookish, a bit geeky, and they were told they would never amount to anything. And I think we all have a similar strain of that. And I just really, from the beginning, I was just attracted to the macabre and anything vaguely odd and supernatural. I mean, I remember, one of my favorite films as a kid was The Ghost of St. Michael's with Will Hay, which is a sort of Scooby-Doo-like story about a haunted school. It's just a silly comedy. And then there's another brilliant one called Oh, Mr. Porter with Will Hay, but it didn't have a ghost in. I remember being terribly disappointed. I thought that's what they did. I've said many times before, I used to watch Pro Celebrity Golf because Christopher Lee was on it. Literally any connection, I used to sort of ferret it out in the TV schedules, and also in books. I remember reading an Agatha Christie ghost story as a child called After the Seance, and one of my all-time favorites, still one of my all-time favorites, an E. Nesbit story called Man Size in Marble, which I'd love to dramatize one day, which is about a couple who move into this cottage, and there's a church on their estate, and it has two crusader effigies in it. And the legend is that one night of the year they get up and walk around. And the wife stays in the cottage one night, and the husband goes off and just wanders up the church, and it happens to be the night. And they're not there. There's just a blank slab where they should be. And he rushes back home, bumps into a local doctor who he sort of gabbles it to, and the doctor tries to reason with him. They go back to the church, and the statues are there, but one of them has a broken finger. And he thinks, I must have just imagined it. So they rush home to see his wife, and she's asleep in a chair by the window. When they get in, of course, she's not. She's dead, with a terrible, terrible stricken look on her face. And as she falls from the chair, her hand opens, and a little marble finger falls out of it. Oh, I loved it. Still do. So to answer your question, Hannah, I just always had an affinity with it. And I really did have I remember certainly one teacher always saying, you live in a dream world, which I absolutely did. But I sort of tried to make it into a practical ambition to write. And I was saying to someone earlier on, I still have a very proud possession of a school report where I got an A+ for English. And Mr. Todd, my teacher, said, great imagination, even if his scripts do resemble Hammer films. Which, it was a badge of honor to me. I was thrilled. But I've met a lot of people over the years, Neil Gaiman, Stephen Moffat, Russell T. Davies, who had a very similar sort of start in terms of, those kind of massive influences drawn from kids' books and TV and old movies. And it's sort of, it doesn't necessarily make a career, but I've been very lucky that it has for me. Yes, next question, please. Drunk again?
So my question is, what makes a great ghost story?
It has to be written by me. It's the only... Well, I'm glad you asked me that, Zach. I think that something that's occurred to me this week, talking a lot about them, is how brilliantly broad the genre is. It occurred to me, I was sort of coalescing things for tonight, and I thought, it's worth saying that every one of us is haunted. That doesn't mean we've all seen a ghost. It doesn't mean we've all believe in ghosts. It doesn't mean we'll see a spook, but we are haunted in every sense by the past, by our memories, by people we've lost, by decisions not taken. I've just done Christmas Carol on stage, which I adapted for Alexandra Palace Theatre, and it's a story I've always wanted to do. And I wrote in the introduction to the script that story is full of ghosts. It's not just the 4 ghosts. It's full of them. It's full of regret. It's full of mistakes. Scrooge has taken the wrong turning, and I think that sort of applies to all of us. So I think the good thing about the genre, and the reason maybe it's survived all these years, is that it is so broad. You can have a proper revenant. You can have something in a stained shroud, coming through your window. You can have a sound or a smell or something like that, which somehow echoes the past. Equally, you can have a presence. Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, which is not technically a ghost story, but it absolutely is, isn't it? It's about the incredible magnetic presence of a dead woman. It couldn't be more. Actually, it's an extraordinarily gothic story, even though there isn't an actual presence in that way, an actual spook. So that's what I think it has. It's a very broad church. However, M.R. James, the great M.R. James, had some rules which are here, which I've always found very interesting. He says, "To be sure, I have my ideas as to how a ghost story ought to be laid out if it is to be effective. I think that, as a rule, the setting should be fairly familiar, and the majority of the characters and their talk such as you may meet or hear any day. A ghost story of which the scene is laid in the 12th or 13th century may succeed in being romantic or poetical, but it will never put the reader into the position of saying to themselves, if I'm not very careful, something of this kind may happen to me. Another requisite, in my opinion, is the ghost should be malevolent or odious. Amiable and helpful apparitions are all very well in fairy tales, but I have no use for them." Also, this is very, very particular to him. For the setting, the detective story cannot be too much up to date. For the ghost story, a slight haze of distance is desirable. 30 years ago, or not long before the war, are very proper openings. And interesting, Edith Wharton, another great ghost story writer, she wrote, this is 1937, "Modern life is too noisy, too diffuse, and too distracted for a ghost to make much headway. Ghosts, to make themselves manifest, require 2 conditions abhorrent to the modern mind: silence and continuity. For where a ghost has once appeared, it seems to hanker to appear again, and it obviously prefers the silent hours when at last the wireless has ceased to jazz." Isn't that lovely? However, I don't agree, because although there is a lovely thing about pushing it back a little, and therefore you have a sort of slight unreliability to the narrator. A friend of mine told me something that happened to a friend of his, or this happened, there was a man used to live here. That's very charming and it really suits it. But equally, I think one of the exciting things about ghost stories' survival is to try and place them absolutely now. And we've been talking this week a lot about how you would develop that idea. So Sarah was saying that she'd read a story called The God App, where someone just checks their phone and there's a new app and it's God. And it's a lovely idea. But also, I was saying, if the devil were real, he would be trying to find new ways to get you. And one of them would be, of course, terms and conditions, which no one ever checks. And then, when the devil appears and says, "Well, you signed it." And stuff like that. I think it's really, those are quite funny ones, but there's lots of ways in which you try and make, as James says, M.R. James says, you need to make the reader think, oh, that could be me. One of the reasons a lot of modern horror films are so successful is because they feel like our world, Paranormal Activity and things like that. It's a world of CCTV and webcams and stuff, so you feel like that's why it's so frightening. You don't have the detachment of it being in the safe past. in the same sort of way. But as I say, I think the lovely thing is it can encompass all kinds of things and all kinds of different scares, really. Yes, next question.
You said in the past that people like nothing more than being scared out of their wits. Why do we like being frightened so much?
I don't know. I slightly qualify that because some people really don't. And to my dismay, over the years, you find lots of people who do, oh no, I can't watch that. I can't watch things like that. And you sort of think, oh, come on, but they really mean it. And it's often people you wouldn't expect. They were actually quite... And queasy is the wrong word, because it's not about gore. It's just they don't like it. So I absolutely love it. So for some people, it's a sort of fairground thing. It's just the thrill of it. But obviously, it's not for everyone. But it's very popular. I mean, you can't argue with that. I've always thought, particularly about horror movies, one of the reasons they're so popular, they never lose money, is because if you go... I remember going to see The Conjuring in a cinema in Cardiff. It was about 3 of us in. And there's a really, really good bit where they play, where the lead thinks that the kids are playing sort of hide and seek. It's the bit with clapping, if you remember. And I'll do it, it's great. So in their version, they go and hide around the house, and then they clap, and someone has to sort of follow the claps to find them. And the mother is they've all gone to bed, and she's sort of doing housework, it's late at night, and she hears them playing, and she sort of shouts, "Go to bed, I told you to go to bed." It carries on, so she goes and checks, and they're all in bed still. But somewhere in the house, she can hear this. So stupidly, she she goes around the house trying to find it, and it's in the cellar. So she goes down to the cellar with a box of matches, or the lights go. She's got a box of matches. She can hear it clapping, and she strikes the first match. Match goes out. Strikes a second match. Nothing there. Strikes a third match, and just behind you see a pair of hands go. And the match goes out. It's fantastic. And there were only about 3 or 4 of us in, but all of us just shrieked and jumped and then started laughing. And that's the reaction you always get, I think. You get this wonderful rush, and then you laugh because it's sort of reassuring, especially if you're in company. People in a full cinema, people turn and they chat to each other, and you get that woo, and it's exciting, But it's not for everyone, clearly, and I find that very, very interesting overall. That I suppose you look at it as a genre, and it's around the world that it's massively popular, but it's definitely not everyone's cup of tea. And sometimes that's about blood and guts. And sometimes it's just about not liking, strangely, not liking being scared. The other reason that horror films are so popular is because they're great date movies. And that's because if you jump, you actually jump into someone's lap. Next, please.
Do you believe in ghosts? And if so, or if not, have you ever seen one?
Well, I'm not actually here. When we met up on Monday evening, it was so like the beginning of a horror movie. I said, you do realize we're all dead. It was just like the opening of a portmanteau movie. We're all killed in a bus on the way here. What I always say is I don't believe in ghosts, but I'm scared of them. I personally think there's something in it, but it's not spirits of the dead, which I don't believe in. It's something else. And there's so much circumstantial evidence over the years, but there's nothing really, there's no clincher. But Ghosts have been seen, people have been seeing ghosts for thousands of years. And there's such a tradition in every country in the world. There's something in it. And, you know, as I explained to you earlier, the problem is, as soon as you start trying to take it apart, you start talking like you're in a horror film, or you start using the language of science fiction. So there's a great, famous ghost story called The Stone Tape by Nigel Neal, who created Quatermass, who's my idol. And it's a modern ghost story. It's commissioned by the BBC in 1972 as a modern ghost story. And he had this brilliant idea. So it's about this group of engineers who move into an old house just for space. It's an old stately home called Taskerlands. And they discover it's haunted. And it really is. There's an apparition. They see it. Each of them sees or hears it in a different way. And Michael Bryant, who plays the lead scientist, he says, we're scientists, we're going to work this out. And he believes that the walls themselves, the stone, has recorded impressions from the past. And they're actually there to try and find a new recording medium, and they realize they've kind of got it. This is it. And what they then discover is it's not as simple as that. But that idea is now called stone tape theory. And in parapsychology, that's what people call it. So art and life have completely merged. So if you start talking about the idea that buildings can retain impressions, or that time can loop or slip, or, I've got a friend of my late sister's used to work at Catterick Garrison. And she worked in the cafe, I think, and she used to get the bus to work, or 2 buses to work every morning in the 70s. And one day she got off the bus early on a summer's morning. She rounded the corner, as she always did, these sort of low, like aerodrome type buildings. And she rounded the corner, and the tarmac was covered in men in bomber jackets, sitting there, reading the paper, smoking, talking. And she stopped, and then a siren went off, and they all scrambled and vanished into the mist. I remember telling me that. And she said, I wasn't dreaming. And you think, well, that seems wonderfully plausible, doesn't it? And I don't know why. Why would that little bit of time replay? I don't know. But it just seems like the sort of thing that could happen. And actually, if you're a physicist and you believe in the multiverse, which any physicist who actually studies quantum physics actually does, I remember seeing a thing with a physicist who said, of course I believe in it, but I can't think about it every day, otherwise I couldn't go to work. It just does your head in. But in a way, the idea of a multiverse in which all these things have happened and are happening and will happen again is sort of the explanation of hauntings, really. But as Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The evidence is not extraordinary. It's very thin. And it's so frustrating when you really want some amazing one-off, this is the one. And some of them are better than others, but they tend to fall apart. You can sort of think it's mass hysteria, or it's someone's personal problems, or it's just water pipes. But every now and then, something makes you go, ooh, that's good. That's a good one. I have seen a ghost. I was at Drury Lane Theatre 20 years ago. There's a famous ghost at Drury Lane, a man in a grey tricorn hat. And it's only ever seen in the daylight. I was sitting on stage waiting to do a photo call, and I looked up at the top of the theatre, the gods, the upper circle, and I saw this figure in a grey tricorn hat. And for 30 seconds, I knew what it was like to see a ghost. And then the ghost said, "The ghost is only ever seen during the hours of daylight." And it was a tour guide dressed up. But for 30 seconds, my heart stopped. It was like, that's it. I hate to disappoint you. Yes, next please. To keep me on the time.
I'm I'm going to try very hard not to be offended if you don't say me, but who is the greatest ghost story writer ever and why?
It's you. Next question, please. Well, this is a tough one because, again, it's about taste, isn't it? And as I say, with such a broad field. But M.R. James, Montague Rhodes James, is the acknowledged master and remains, immensely popular. What is lovely about him? I made a documentary about him, which you can see illegally on YouTube at any time. And he was such an unassuming man. He was an antiquarian. He spent his entire life. He went from Eton to Cambridge back to Eton. Never really had much to do with the outside world, and that's the sort of essence of his stories. There, it's a very cloistered world, very closeted world as well. But he wrote these stories as Christmas entertainments which he read out on Christmas Eve in his rooms for his friends, and then was eventually persuaded to publish them. And then years later, he published another volume. But he had no literary pretensions. He wrote a couple of other books about the history of East Anglia, and one very strange children's story. But he didn't think of himself in that way at all. But they are absolutely brilliant. And he is the one, his little extract from Canon Alberich's scrapbook. So this is about a man, an antiquarian like him, who goes to a village in France, and he finds for sale this scrapbook, which is full of absolutely priceless pictures, torn from much older books. And one of them is a picture of King Solomon's court, which is the king and his courtiers, and then this creature. He says, "I entirely despair of conveying by any words the impression which this figure makes upon anyone who looks at it. I recollect once showing the photograph of the drawing to a lecturer on morphology, a person of, I was going to say, abnormally sane and unimaginative habits of mind. He absolutely refused to be alone for the rest of that evening, and he told me afterwards that for many nights he had not dared to put the light out before going to sleep. However, the main traits of the figure I can at least indicate. At first you saw only a mass of coarse, matted black hair. Presently it was seen that this covered a body of fearful thinness, almost a skeleton, but with the muscles standing out like wires. The hands were of a dusky pallor, covered like the body with long, coarse hairs and hideously taloned. The eyes, touched in with a burning yellow, had intensely black pupils, and were fixed upon the throned king with the look of beast-like hate. Imagine one of the awful bird-catching spiders of South America translated into human form and endowed with intelligence just less than human, and you will have some faint conception of the terror inspired by this appalling effigy. One remark is universally made by those to whom I have shown the picture. It was drawn from the life." It's very famous, that, but he had such a, as earlier as with the not the mouth of a human being, an amazing turn of phrase. And he has these rules which he largely applies. And the best stories have this brilliant sort of creeping dread about them. They start very ordinarily, someone telling a story to someone about something that happened to someone they know, or someone finding a manuscript which they shouldn't have looked at, someone digging where they shouldn't. And they're funny as well. He clearly wrote some of the voices so he could do some of his funny voices when he was telling the stories. But they're also very nasty. Some of it is Warning to the Curious, one of his best ones, where Mr. Paxton is digging for the 3 lost crowns of East Anglia, and he shouldn't. And he uncovers them, but there's a guardian over them. And brilliantly, when asked what he's going to do with them, he says, there's only one left. He says, "I'm going to put it back." But it's too late. And the guardian lures him to his death. And when they find his body, it says his jaw was smashed to bits. I remember that as a kid, because, oh God, that's awful. It's not just a sort of off-stage death. It's really horrible. So it's an amazing combination James has of these brilliant little turns of phrase, funny situations and clever ideas, like the Metzitin, which I just adapted for Christmas, is about a picture that changes every time you look at it, and he's really wonderful. So he's the acknowledged master. My next favorite is E.F. Benson, who was is still most famous for his Map and Lucia stories. Great favorite of ours. Really, really funny social comedies. But in his day, he was best known as a ghost story writer. Spook stories, he called these. And this is one of my favorites. It's called The Room in the Tower. And it's about the narrator has a recurring dream where he arrives at a big red brick house, and there's this very domineering woman presiding. She's called Mrs. Stone. And every time he has the dream, they're having a party on the lawn, and she says, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." And he's filled with this awful kind of dread, and then he wakes up, and from childhood onwards, he's always having this dream. And then one day, of course, he accepts an invitation to a party, falls asleep in the car. Only when he wakes up does he realize he's outside the house. And he goes out into the lawn. It's exactly as it was in the dream, except there's another woman there, a very pleasant woman. And she says, "We're absolutely full up. Jack will show you your room. I've given you the room in the tower." And he goes in to the room, and there's a painting of the woman from his dreams, a self-portrait of Mrs. Julia Stone. And he says, "A picture that, in spite of the evident feebleness of the body, had a dreadful exuberance and vitality. It shone through the envelope of flesh, a vitality that foamed and frothed with unimaginable evil." So they take the painting out, and then he's all right. But then he wakes from a troubled sleep. "I sat bolt upright in bed under the impression that some bright light had been flashed in my face, though it was now absolutely pitch dark. I knew exactly where I was, in the room which I had dreaded in dreams. But no horror that I ever felt when asleep approached the fear that now invaded and froze my brain. Immediately after, a peal of thunder crackled just above the house, but the probability that it was only a flash of lightning which awoke me gave me no reassurance to my galloping heart. Something, I knew, was in the room with me, and instinctively I put out my right hand, which was nearest the wall, to keep it away, and my hand touched the edge of a picture frame hanging close to me. I sprang out of bed, upsetting the small table that stood by it, and I heard my watch, candle, and matches clatter onto the floor. But for the moment, there was no need of light, for a blinding flash leapt out of the clouds and showed me that by my bed again hung the picture of Mrs. Stone. And instantly the room went into blackness again. But in that flash I saw another thing also, namely a figure that leaned over the end of my bed, watching me. It was dressed in some close clinging white garment, spotted and stained with mold, and the face was that of the portrait. Overhead the thunder cracked and roared, and when it ceased and the deathly stillness succeeded, I heard the rustle of movement coming near to me, and more horrible yet, perceived an odor of corruption and decay. And then a hand was laid on the side of my neck, and close beside my ear I heard quick-taken, eager breathing. Yet I knew that this thing, though it could be perceived by touch, by smell, by eye and by ear, was still not of this earth, but something that had passed out of the body and had power to make itself manifest. Then a voice, already familiar to me, spoke. "I knew you would come to the room in the tower," it said. "I have been waiting long for you. At last you have come. Tonight I shall feast. Before long we will feast together." Yum, yum. But Benson has, his stories are very particular. There's a lot of similarities to the world of Map and Lucia. There's a lot of confirmed bachelors taking summer's leases on little villas and things. And there's an amazing story called Mrs. Amworth, which is sort of a neighbor to Tilling, about this very blousy lady who comes and moves into this little village, and they gradually realize she's a vampire. It's terrific. And Edith Wharton, as I mentioned, Shirley Jackson, she's an incredible writer. I mean, everyone knows she's brilliant. But her most famous story is The Haunting of Hill House, which is one of the only longer form ghost stories, an absolute stone cold masterpiece. But her short stories are absolutely fantastic as well. She also, as I was telling Hannah earlier, she had the best response I've ever seen to a critic. She sent this beautiful little typed letter saying, "Dear Mrs. Harris, if you don't like my peaches, don't shake my tree." But everyone has different favorites. The reason we return to M.R. James so much is because really he's the most popular, and those stories are very, very famous. A lot of people grew up with them, but there's an awful lot of new writers, and what's really exciting is that it just continues the form. I think Dickens wrote several great ghost stories, and there's a lot of famous people had a go at one. It's almost like a challenge. It's a bit like writing it's like when they keep getting people to write James Bond novels. Oh, I'll do one, they say, but it's interesting how it can be very hard to get right, because to try and do something new and keep pushing it forward is very difficult. That's why I love the idea of embracing the modern, of sort of saying, in a way, these rules and these tropes of the ghost story. It's a bit like I said earlier. Sorry if I'm repeating myself. I did this row. When people do a religious painting, it's like it's called the crucifixion, but there are 3,000 different versions of it, and the form of the ghost story is like that. And then you have your go, someone else has a go, and they can do all kinds of different stuff with it. Yeah, there we are. So I guess we should, oh gosh, it's just about time. We can throw open questions to the floor, if the floor has anything to say.
Do we have any questions from the floor for Mark?
I always say this is famously when Alan Bennett first did a Q&A, there was absolute silence, and then someone put their hand up and said, "Where did you get your shoes?"
Thank you. You spoke about the success of, say, The Conjuring, and obviously the praise you have for M.R. James. Is there now a difficulty trying to put the historic ghost story in a modern kind of context, or are we just moving forward now and things like The Conjuring will be more successful and people forget about the Dickens or the M.R. James and move into the contemporary?
I hope not, because I'm just doing them now. But, I mean, there's, inevitably, I think, in terms of what Hollywood studios are looking for, it's the modern day is cheaper, and there is that thing of trying, you're trying to get especially a teenage audience. It's harder to get them to commit to something with period trappings, but obviously it still does happen. And interestingly, the second Conjuring film is about the Enfield haunting. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It's a remarkable film because, against all expectations, they get Enfield's 1976 really right. It's like, snorkel jackets, rally choppers. I remember thinking, this is, wow. And then they go to the house, and it's like the Amityville Horror. It's this tiny council house in Enfield, which has a root cellar. And like vast attics. It's like the TARDIS. It really works up to a point that it completely falls apart. But I'm a huge fan of the waistcoat and the carriage chase, but equally it's very exciting, I think, to try and keep it going into the modern day, and as I say, reinventing some of the traditional things, but also trying to find new scares. I mean, there's a lot to be frightened of, and I think the best horror always taps into our current preoccupations. Isn't it? For myself, for instance, I have become increasingly squeamish. Even things I used to watch with no problem at all when I was a kid, I have difficulty with any blood. But the thing I absolutely can't watch are home invasion films. I don't want to watch them. The supernatural I love because it's not real. But the idea you come home and someone's in your house threatening your nearest and dearest, it terrifies me. I can't go near them. I've seen funny games, and what's the French one? Them. It's horrible. And I don't find it a pleasurable horror at all, I have to say. But that's just my taste. Yes, who's next?
Okay, yes, I have got one online actually.
Shadowy other at the back.
So online we've got Matt, and he says, what do you feel is the scariest piece of media of any that you have seen, read or heard?
There's this YouTube clip called Two Girls, One Cup. And, oh, that's a good one. Well, I mean, you know, you have to think about films and TV, don't you? But obviously, people are in the TikTok age. What's brilliant about what's going on is people are able to sort of conjure up these things, edit them, make them, put them out there with no necessary intermediaries at all. And I'm sure there'll be some brilliant little sort of 2-minute horror films made like that. But my favourites, the film that scared me the most as a child was The Haunting, which is Robert Wise's film of The Haunting of Hill House. Still amazing piece of work. And I've said this many times, but one of the reasons it frightened me the most is my dad was visibly terrified. And when the person who's never terrified is terrified, it really gets you. It scared the life out of me. It's a brilliant film. Night of the Demon, The Innocents, more up to date, the original TV version, The Woman in Black, incredible piece of work. The Ring, obviously. I think The Ring is the last film that scared the life out of me. And it was also because it was so original, wasn't it? It was like everything was like, what's this? What is this thing? Where's it going? And when it crawls towards you out the TV, it's like, I just didn't want to look at it. The Witch is really good, and I was talking about that today, and really delightful. I love anything that sort of uses old language in that Nigel Neal way or M.R. James way to sort of ventriloquize the way people used to talk, and it's sort of like Salem, but if it were true. But when the witch finally comes, she looks like a witch should. She's a crone, and it's really horrible. And there's some kids in a barn and with a cow, and they've only got one lamp, and they hear this percussion on the roof like she's landed. And then in the dark, they hear this, and she lifts up the lamp, and something is suckling on the cow. And she turns around, she's naked, of course, as all witches should be. And it's just utterly horrifying. And I was watching it with Stephen Rees from the League of Gentlemen. We just went, ugh, chorus. Yeah. But I think The Haunting is still the thing that frightened me the most.
Okay, any more from the floor? Yes, one here.
It's like an online auction.
Did you ever write ghost stories as a kid and by accident scare yourself?
I did, yes. I mean, like everyone, I think I started writing at school. As I say, I had that school report, and I actually got in trouble because I would make every story a horror story, everyone. There was a story called A Day at the Beach, and it's about a family at the beach, and they found a head in a bucket. I remember that one. And then what happened was, it was a fateful parents-teachers evening. And I remember it was a Friday night because my parents came back and they were furious, and they just basically banned me from watching horror movies. And I was in bits because that was Friday night when horror films used to be on, Appointment with Fear, as it was called in Tyne Tees. And that night was Revenge of Frankenstein, a very rare Hammer. Still rare, it's never shown. It's a great film. The second Hammer, Frankenstein with Peter Cushing. I'd never seen it, so I was 11, and I pleaded and pleaded and pleaded. They wouldn't give in, and I was sent to bed. And then it's like 10:15, and then I heard them go to bed, and my sister was staying up to watch it, and I gave it 15 minutes, and I crept downstairs and watched it anyway. And that was the end of my ban. But I used to write these stories all the time, and then the first money I ever earned from writing, I used to write revenge dramas about killing our teachers. There was a string of teachers we all hated, and they were all dispatched in increasingly horrific ways. And I used to sell little photocopies of them. I'm all right now. Yes.
Okay, I've got Yeah, I'll do this one down here. There's another one online.
Thank you. I'm one of those very suggestible people who can't read or ghost stories or watch horror films unless I'm behind the sofa. I was wondering what I should read to ease myself in gently, please.
Oh, you don't want to do that. Well, I don't know. There are, as I say, there are different categories and sort of styles. I mean, so James used to call them. He wanted things to have a pleasing terror. So, as I say, he wrote his stories to be read on Christmas Eve by the fire, and there's a lot of fun in them. It just depends what your threshold is, really. I mean, also, obviously, some things dramatize, I suppose, more frighteningly, but there are some things. Oh, I remember reading. Peter Straub wrote this wonderful book called Ghost Story. It's a novel. He was inspired. Stephen King wrote Salem's Lot, which is like a response to Dracula in a way. And Peter Straub thought, I'm going to do that with the ghost story. So he wrote this wonderful novel about 4 old men who have a ghost story club called the Chowder Society. And they tell each other ghost stories every Saturday night, something. But they've all got a shared secret which comes back to get them. And there's one chapter where one of the characters, Lewis, who's played by Douglas Fairbanks Jr. in the movie, is running through a forest and he thinks something's with him. And I remember genuinely turning that book over and waiting because I was frightened. This is what a rare feeling. I just didn't really, I wanted to continue, but I also didn't because it was scaring the life out of me. So I think, yesterday's terror is today's mildness. And, you could put most Hammer films on in the afternoon now and no one would bat an eyelid. But there are still things that can really make your hair stand on end. I don't know what we... Well, actually, there used to be one of the things called the Armada Book of Ghost Stories for Kiddies. So you could probably get them on eBay. But I think some of them, as I remember, were really horrible. But then that's what children like.
I've just got one online here, actually. What's your advice from Sophie? What's your advice to horror writers who are looking to break into the industry? Is there anything you'd advise to get your foot in the door?
Come to Dartington College. Get your foot in the door, yes, an extra foot. That's a good title. The extra foot. Well, it's the same as anything like that. It's a tough business, but you have to be persistent, and also you just have to, I think, have some talent and keep going. But the good thing about horror is, as I say, horror films never lose money, and there's a reason that most great filmmakers actually sort of start out making cheap horror movies, is because it's a good way of learning your craft, but also you can actually do it for nothing and make a bit of money back. So Sophie's in the right game, as it were, by trying to get a genre film made, I think. But it's as tough as any other aspect of the business, I think. That's the true horror story.
If you found you came back as a ghost, what would you do?
If I came back as a ghost? This looks like a carpenter's cup. What would I do? Oh, God, I know exactly what I'd do. I would haunt Boris Johnson. Forever and ever and ever. And ever. Even after he was dead. Don't know. I think if I would come back and try and give someone tangible proof rather than just going... Richard Dawkins brilliantly said, why do ghosts, why is it always so banal? And why do people ask them these banal questions? Why don't they say, what's it like being dead? That's the only answer you get. That's one of the things I mean about extraordinary evidence, or the thinness of the evidence, is that when you think, oh, there's something in that, oh, this medium told me this, and you go, what did they tell you? And they tell you, he's looking down on you. Now, I'll tell you a story. Derek Acora, the now dead medium, who used to be on Most Haunted. I used to have a video, a video of him live in concert in Liverpool. And this is amazing. It's so revealing, this. So he does the usual thing. It's total cold reading. He looks in the audience. He says, I've got there's a George, William, Edgar, Edward. Edward? Woman puts her hand up and he goes, have you lost someone, love? Yeah, lost someone. He's looking down on you. He's got grey hair. Brilliant. And he loves the kiddies. Yeah, he loves the kiddies. Yeah, he is the grandkids. He loves them. Yeah, he's beaming at you. Yeah, he always used to smile. Yeah, and he loves. And the youngest kiddie, he loves computers, doesn't he? No. He will do. And he's dropped her like a stone. She leaves there going, it was amazing. He talked to my dad, Edward, but also George and William, which she conveniently forgets, and that, I hate those people. I hate them. I think it's so grim. It's properly leeching on people's grief, and it's just despicable. But I can't remember when I said this now. But that's who I'd haunt. No, but I would maybe come back and try and pass a message saying, okay, I'm dead. It's awful. Wish I was alive. It's cold. Or I don't know if anyone's seen this. There's a new play in the West End called 222 by Danny Robbins. It's very good, very entertaining, very clever ghost story, very creepy. But there's a brilliant bit in it where one of the characters, who's a skeptic, does a ghost quiz. And amongst the things he says are they're so good, these questions. Why do we never see cavemen ghosts? Why are they always that type, that certain vintage, if you see them? And also, brilliantly, why aren't ghosts naked? Clothes do not die. I love that. I never thought of that before. Yeah, that's what I do. Yes.
Who else was on the floor? Yeah, sorry.
So a lot of my favourite horror experiences have been through playing video games. I wondered if you've ever played horror games or if you'd consider writing for them.
I've played Pong. I'm afraid to say, remarkably, I'm not 35 anymore. Video games have entirely passed me by. I was at the wrong age when they sort of started to arrive, and I just have no interest in them. I know they're good, and I've seen the graphics so I've seen people playing them, and I know they have now become really, genuinely an art form in themselves, and they're astonishing. But it just doesn't do it for me. I don't know. I think maybe because I like to see a story unfold in front of me rather than being a player in it. Maybe I'm just too frightened. It's possible. Maybe that's the thing that would frighten me. That's very interesting, though, and that you're pointing the way to the future, because that's how people, maybe like Sophie, can get into the industry, is writing horror games rather than horror stories per se. But yeah, I'm afraid it's just not my bag. Does anyone else play horror games? Oh yes, Charlie's nodding. Yes, anyone else?
Oh, great, yeah.
I can't see.
Got so many online now, it's unreal.
Just wondering, what are your thoughts on the links between comedy and horror, and why do you think the two of them tend to be looked down on as sort of lesser genres?
You mean individually they do, or together?
Well, sort of, yeah, individually. People tend to, comedy and horror films never win Oscars or anything like that.
I think a very good idea would be to do a comedy horror series with a group of characters set in a fictional northern village. I'm very pro it. I mean, when we did The League of Gentlemen, it was never like a formula. It was just what made us laugh. And because we were the people we are, our influences were very strongly comedy and horror. And to this day, some of our favorite stuff is the Theatre of Blood, obviously Carry On Screaming, You know, there's lots of them. The House in Nightmare Park, I love that film. Frankie Howard film. Have you eaten Mr. 12 Trees? I had a packet of crisps, he says. But they do work together, and I think joyously. And as I was saying about M.R. James, there's a lot more humor in it than people give it credit for. In fact, I think the best things, like the brilliant Exorcist 3, if anyone hasn't seen it, I recommend you do. It's a direct sequel to the original film. It's a wonderful film. And it's very funny. The first 20 minutes are just very funny. It's written and directed by William Peter Blatty, who wrote the original. And he wrote A Shot in the Dark. He was a comedy writer who then wrote this amazing horror film. But I think they go together very well. And it's very pleasing, that. But equally, you're absolutely right. There is a snobbery about it. Frederick March and Anthony Hopkins are the only people to win a Best Actor Oscar for horror movies, for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Silence of the Lambs, if you count Silence of the Lambs as a horror film, which I do. And comedies very rarely win. It's weird, isn't it? It's the hardest thing in the world. Everyone loves a good laugh, and yet it seems always to be sort of like, oh yeah, but that's just funny. That's like being just sexy. It's just, you can't just lightly dismiss it like that, but people do. It's funny, and I think it's a real shame. I think to me, it's a bit like the way that those Pixar films are routinely the best film of the year, and all they win is best song. But they are, I mean, the humanity and the grown-upness of a film, of the first 15 minutes of Up, for instance, or something like Coco is a film about death for children. It's amazing. It's an amazing film. It's so moving. I cry thinking about it. But it's a glorious thing. But it's a cartoon, isn't it? So therefore, somehow it's never going to get the Oscars that the big grown-up films get, that they all forget about in 10 years, you know. Yes.
I've got one online here from.
Is it from a Nigerian prince?
It's in the League of Gentlemen Christmas special. You played a female vampire character who was married to a German choir master. Did you enjoy playing that character, and was it your idea?
Yes, I did. I don't remember. Well, it was that's the hare-lip vampire story set in Duisburg in 1975, as I recall. So it's a direct homage to mid-70s vampire films. And then when I take the wig off at the end, it's just Nosferatu, or perhaps really Mr. Barlow from Salem's Lot. Yes, I did enjoy it. I had the funniest thing, we had this a bit doing Dracula recently, that what's lovely and funny is that the same problems always recur. Your fangs fall out, it's too hot, if you have contact lenses, they really hurt, and Christopher Lee never stopped moaning about his bloodshot eyes, and Clay Spang, who played Dracula, he was going, this cloak is so fucking heavy. And it's exactly what Christopher Lee used to say. In fact, we changed it for the second episode because it was just like, he was like wearing a carpet. You know, I was quite reassured by all those things just happening again. Yes.
There's also another one kind of associated with a question online about the association with Christmas and ghosts.
Yes. Well, I'm asked this. Indeed, every Christmas I'm asked this. And I did an interview this Christmas, and I said to the Radio Times, you could actually just reprint the one you did last year, where I said the same things I'm about to say now, which is that I think it sort of starts as maybe a fireside tradition, the turn of the year. There's something good about that, the idea of looking backwards and looking forwards, that at Christmas time you're always thinking about people who aren't there anymore, and therefore it's a good time to think about them perhaps popping back or something like that. Dickens is a huge part of that. Like most of our traditions, they're not as old as we like to think they are. And I think Dickens' kind of reinvention of Christmas is a huge part of that. But they just go together so well. It's really interesting. Some of it, I think, is a reaction against the jolliness of Christmas. Sometimes the enforced jolliness of it means that you actually seek out something which is slightly stronger meat than Quality Street, as it were. But I don't know, they just click. They always have. It just feels right. It feels like the sort of thing you should be reading or experiencing at Christmas time.
Thank you. We've got time for one more from the floor.
One more from the floor.
One more from the floor.
This is one of those 40-minute Zooms. It's just going to stop in a minute.
Out of all the horror and ghost stories that you've written, which one are you most proud of?
Oh, gosh. I don't know. I don't know. Well, I've been very lucky to sort of revive the BBC tradition in the last few years. And I'm hoping to keep it going because it's lovely and people always like it to be there. I think the last one I did, the Mezzotint, has gone down very well, and that was a very happy production. You know, it's very tight budget and very tight time, but I think it came out very well. I suppose I would always say like the most recent one, but I did one a couple of years ago called The Dead Room, which is with Simon Callow about a radio host, and we filmed it at Maida Vale Studios. And I wrote that specifically because we had so little money. It had to be like one location, 3 actors maximum, 3 days filming. But what I tried to do was essentially dramatize M.R. James's rules. Simon plays this radio host who's been doing this horror show for 40 years. And his producer doesn't know anything, so he sort of pompously lectures her, like I'm doing now, about the rules of the game. And he does all the stuff about, you need a little haze of distance 30 years ago, say. So, and his producer says, so like, would a ghost from the 70s work? Which is the question I pose myself. And the ghost in it is from the long hot summer of 1976, because I thought, well, does it work? I think it does. And weirdly, something which to us doesn't feel like that long ago has a certain haze of distance now, you know. So I was very pleased with that one. But I just loved doing them, to be honest. It's obviously such a privilege to be able to do M.R. James or anyone, adapt them or write new ones, and just try and keep that flavor alive and also keep pushing it forward. You know, that's what I'm very interested in doing, because I think it does. You know, they remain very popular for a reason. People still see ghosts. They have a lot of stories. People gather people together in a room, and someone will have a really good story, and it does something communally to us. I think it might. As we've just been discussing this week, also because it lets people think there might be something bigger than this. There isn't. But it's actually very comforting. And weirdly, for something which is meant to scare you, there is a comfort in that as well, you know. I feel like Dave Allen, which is all I've ever wanted to do. Good night, and may your God go with you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been amazing.
Thank you.
Just to thank everybody really for coming tonight. It's been fantastic. It feels like old Dartington. It feels like before, 2 years ago when we've had just amazing energy from the students here this week, freedom of expression, and excitingly for us tomorrow, they're going to be performing their pieces in Studio One. They don't know about it. But yes, please do visit the bookshop. Mark has signed his books if you're interested.
And a lot of other people's.
And a lot of other, yeah, it was like, yeah, I thought the Very Hungry Caterpillar but was a bit much. But yeah, no, do have a look on the bookshop on the way out, or just chat, and if you've got a book, Mark will sign it, I'm sure. But thanks again. Just want to thank Mark for coming to Dartington. It means the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Just like the end of a chat.